This is a story of power, proximity, and pressure of a prominent Iranian political figure whose family connections have reached across oceans, and of an increasingly fragile set of alliances testing the limits of diplomacy in a standoff over one of the world's most strategic waterways. At the center of this moment is Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Iran's parliament. New reporting has placed members of his family in the spotlight, linking them to property interests and academic ties in Australia that raise fresh questions about how democracies track the financial footprints of senior foreign officials. Those revelations arrive at a time when negotiations to end the war between Iran and the United States are stalled, when European partners are weighing naval options to keep vital shipping lanes open, and when Tehran is issuing stark warnings about any foreign military role in the Strait of Hormuz. Australian reporting shows that for more than a decade, the Ghalibaf family maintained connections to Melbourne. At least one investment property in Australia, a rental asset, was reportedly generating income that was collected by Ghalibaf's son, identified in the reporting as Esha Ghalibaf. The family is also said to have links to a research center at the University of Melbourne. Those ties include residency arrangements that, according to the reporting, allowed long-term access to the country. At the same time, other countries have taken a different approach. Canada is reported to have refused visa applications from the same son on 2 occasions, citing concerns tied to the Iranian regime. The contrast matters. In Canada, visa refusals underscore a strict posture on any connection to officials or institutions associated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. In Australia, critics and some diplomats are asking why the same kinds of connections did not trigger equivalent measures and whether current sanctions regimes are being applied consistently. When family members, rather than the official himself, are the conduit for overseas holdings. The result is a renewed debate in Canberra about due diligence enforcement and the blurred line between private property and the strategic interests of a foreign power. None of this exists in a vacuum. The disclosures about cross-border financial ties surfaced against the backdrop of a faltering diplomatic track. In Washington, President Donald Trump publicly rejected Tehran's latest response to a U.S. ceasefire proposal, calling it totally unacceptable. That blunt rebuff has hardened the diplomatic contours of the crisis and narrowed the window for a negotiated end to the fighting. With the U.S. keeping up pressure, including a naval blockade on Iranian ports, Tehran has been issuing increasingly forceful statements about its own rights and responsibilities in the Gulf. On May 10th, the senior Iranian diplomat left little doubt about how Tehran views any foreign naval presence in the Strait of Hormuz. Deputy Foreign Minister Kazem Gharibabadi warned that any extra-regional deployment would be treated as a hostile act and would elicit a decisive response. Only the Islamic Republic of Iran can establish security in this strait, he said, insisting that Iran would not allow other countries to interfere in what it calls its sovereign responsibility. The warning was direct, narrowly focused on sovereignty and legal claims, but it carried an unmistakable strategic message: foreign ships moving closer to the choke point risk crossing a red line. That warning came just as Western capitals were weighing ways to ensure the free flow of commerce through the region. Britain and France have talked publicly about coordinating a maritime security mission to reassure commercial shipping, safeguard passage, and officials say deter threats to civilian traffic. London and Paris say the proposed mission is about stabilizing shipping lanes that have been disrupted by the conflict, protecting merchant vessels, and preparing for eventual mine clearance and deconfliction work once hostilities ease. For countries dependent on Gulf energy and agricultural exports, reopening reliable routes is not an academic exercise. It is a matter of food security, fuel prices, and the global economy. French President Emmanuel Macron, speaking in Nairobi during an official visit, sought to walk a careful line. He emphasized Europe's intent to protect freedom of navigation and to prevent any blockade-style restrictions that choke trade. Freedom of navigation, he said, framing the mission as a defensive and humanitarian effort aimed at keeping goods moving, fertilizers, food, fuel, and other essentials rather than a projection of force. He also made a public point of saying France had never envisaged a direct military operation to force open the Strait of Hormuz and insisted that any maritime posture would be coordinated with regional states and designed to de-escalate rather than. Nameflame, still Macron acknowledged he had moved major naval assets, including the carrier strike group centered on the aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle, toward the wider region, repositioning ships through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and into waters adjacent to the Gulf and the southern Red Sea. Paris framed that deployment as readiness rather than provocation, a signal to allies and partners that Europe could act responsibly to protect commercial traffic while remaining open to diplomatic channels with Tehran. But the optics are complex. For Iran, the presence of Western warships anywhere near the approaches to the Gulf is easily portrayed as coercive. For Washington, any European reluctance to participate in a U.S.-led maritime posture risks creating the impression of diplomatic drift among allies at a moment when coordinated action matters. Those divisions have put a strain on the alliance at a time when the calculus for each partner is different. The United States, focused on maximum pressure, has publicly tied de-escalation to concessions from Tehran that include guarantees on nuclear behavior and the restoration of security guarantees it finds acceptable. Iran has pushed back, demanding an end to the blockade, a rollback of sanctions, and political assurances that would reduce its vulnerability to future attacks. European governments, balancing domestic economic concerns with strategic priorities, are trying to thread a needle, deter further attacks on shipping without triggering direct confrontation, preserve the possibility of dialogue, and protect commercial routes that sustain everyday life far beyond the region. Against this great power chessboard, the revelations about the Ghalibaf family add an uncomfortable human dimension. They suggest that the network of influence and finance for senior Iranian officials can reach into allied countries, into universities and rental markets, while legal and diplomatic responses vary from one democracy to another. That asymmetry can be exploited politically by opponents on all sides. Critics of the Iranian regime will point to the overseas foothold as evidence of hypocrisy. Opponents of tougher measures will warn that overreach risks alienating partners and undermining legal norms governing property and residency. What is undeniable is the strategic importance of the Strait of Hormuz itself. Narrow, heavily trafficked, and strategically located, the strait is the gateway that links the oil-producing Persian Gulf to the wider world. Historically, about a fifth of global petroleum shipments have transited those waters. When flow through the strait slows, whether because of mines, harassment, blockades, or military activity, the effects ripple through energy markets, shipping insurance, and the cost of everyday goods. Governments, therefore, face hard choices: act to keep the lanes open and risk confrontation, or step back and accept higher prices and constrained supply. Iran's repeated public insistence that only it can guarantee the strait's security taps into a deep narrative of sovereignty and regional prerogative. Tehran frames external naval deployments as an attempt to militarize a waterway adjacent to coastal states, a move it interprets as an effort to cover up what it calls the true sources of insecurity. Those claims resonate domestically and among regional partners that view Western military presence with skepticism. Yet for many Gulf states and the global trading system, the idea of singular control over a heavily used international passage raises obvious concerns about the freedom of navigation and the rights of neutral vessels under international law. Diplomatically, the recent exchanges expose how fragile the moment is. Trump's public rejection of Tehran's response to the latest U.S. proposal has hardened Washington's posture and undercut momentum toward a ceasefire. Tehran, in turn, is less inclined to accept terms that do not address its demand for sanctity, arms relief and guarantees. European capitals, meanwhile, are trying to shepherd a multilateral maritime mission that can reassure commerce while keeping open channels for negotiation. The differences in tone and emphasis between Washington, Paris, and London are small in words but large in effect. They define whether the world sees a united front or a coalition of like-minded but independently acting states. The human stakes in all of this are immediate and tangible. Ship crews operate under greater risk, insurers raise premiums, farmers and manufacturers face higher input costs, ordinary consumers confront rising prices at the pump and in grocery aisles. Diplomatic missteps or miscalculations at sea can trigger cascades that reach far beyond capitals and command centers. That is why leaders are both guarded and public in their statements, to deter miscalculation, to reassure domestic audiences, and to preserve strategic options. For democratic governments, the Ghalibaf revelation also raised questions about transparency and the limits of influence. How should host countries respond when family members of senior foreign officials hold property, academic posts, or residency? When does a private transaction become a matter of national security? How consistent are countries prepared to be in applying sanctions or visa restrictions? Those are policy debates with legal, moral, and strategic dimensions, and they are likely to play out in parliaments, courts, and the court of public opinion over the weeks to come. From Tehran's perspective, drawing regional lines of authority serves both immediate tactical aims and long-term strategic narratives. By asserting control over the Strait of Hormuz as a matter of sovereign right, Iran seeks to normalize a posture that gives it leverage over shipping and, by extension, over economic and diplomatic pressure on other states. From the West's perspective, preventing a single state from monopolizing security in a vital international artery is a core interest that has broad global implications. So where does that leave us? With a classic international dilemma, competing claims, overlapping interests, and a shortage of trust. For now, the immediate horizon looks uncertain. Diplomatic channels remain frayed but open in pockets. European partners are attempting to chart a middle course that protects commerce while avoiding direct military ignition. And the United States is pressing for terms it can accept while rejecting proposals it views as insufficient. At the same time, the disclosure of overseas ties linked to a powerful Iranian official has injected a domestic accountability story into an already volatile international mix. If there is a practical way forward, it requires three elements. First, clarity and consistency among allies about the purpose, scope, and legal basis of any maritime mission so that actions are defensible, proportional, and coordinated. Second, rigorous, transparent processes for scrutinize. NG, foreign, financial, and residency ties in democracies, processes that protect legitimate private activity while guarding against abuse. And third, renewed diplomatic engagement that can translate security arrangements at sea into political guarantees on land, a compact that reduces incentives for escalation and opens the door to a negotiated settlement. History teaches a cautionary lesson. Choke points do not yield easily to simple solutions. Security in a narrow strait depends as much on the interplay of politics and law as it does on the positioning of ships. What happens next will hinge on leaders' willingness to balance deterrence with de-escalation, enforcement with engagement, and national interest with global responsibility. For people living in the Gulf states, for the crews who still ply that world's trade routes, and for millions who feel the pinch of supply disruptions, the coming days will be a test of whether diplomacy can hold before force fills the vacuum. The store one, politicians' overseas ties may be a domestic scandal in Canberra, but it is also a reminder that in an interconnected world, private wealth, public power, and international security are never far apart. This is a moment that demands careful judgment, consistent rules, and a steady hand at the helm, because in the narrow channel where the Gulf meets the world, the consequences of misunderstanding or miscalculation would be felt far beyond the water's edge.